At least for me, Dragons Rising Season 2 was a new peak for the franchise. It took all of the concepts and ideas that Season 1 had and ran with them, giving us some of the best storytelling, character development, and even visuals the franchise had ever seen. Almost everything about the season was perfect, and while Dragons Rising Season 1 did a good job of laying the groundwork for this new era of the show, Season 2 is what really propelled it to greatness and really fulfilled the potential this show had to offer, and pushed it to new heights never before seen by Ninjago. The future of Dragons Rising was bright, and at the time it seemed that Season 3 was going to be an absolute slam dunk follow-up, and possibly a new peak with how each installment of Dragons Rising seemed to be getting better and more engaging than the last. However, in the lead up to Season 3, more and more things started to feel a bit off about this season. There seemed to be a heavy focus on Zane, and while not as bad as he was previously, he still wasn't good by any means in Dragons Rising, so having a part focused on him could either do wonders for his character, or make him even worse, and with an imminent P.I.X.A.L return, I had a strong feeling that it was going to be the latter. For Forbidden 5 as main villains was also a bit concerning, because while they were incredibly cool in the latter half of Season 2, Nox does conceptually work best when he's playing second fiddle to the far more interesting Ras, who seemed to be taking a backseat from being the main villain here to focus on his dynamic with Arin. Despite all of this, the thing that worried me the most was Mora's return, because while he's a character that I do really like, they brought him back right as Arin had turned to Raz's side, and him quote unquote redeeming Arin would be the single biggest mistake in the entire Ninjago franchise, and would completely ruin their entire plotline. With all of this in mind, I came to really dread the eventual release of this season, and I was really worried that it would just completely ruin everything the past 2 seasons had built up. But now, almost a year later from these concerns starting to manifest, we have the 3rd season of Dragons Rising released officially in full. So, do I think it ruined the show? And this might be surprising considering the title of this video, but no, I don't think this season ruined Dragons Rising by any means. And I think that this is a solid season of Ninjago, but before we start, I cannot emphasize enough that I do like this season and I think it is good. I really want to make this point because I cannot emphasize enough that this thing is good and I don't think it ruined the show, and I need you to keep this in mind because I do have a lot of problems with this season and I will be talking about them in review. With that being said, please bear with me as I try to break down all the ways this season does and doesn't work for me. I think the most logical place to start with this season is Zane. He was all over the box art for this season, has a bunch of different variants and a bunch of different Zane themed sets. So it was clear going in that he was going to be getting more attention than usual from the writers. And I think my take on this is pretty obvious if you've seen any of my stuff before, but they did not do him any justice this season. In concept, a season where Zane has a new, larger form and a new body is a great way to pick up on the Identity Crisis storyline from Season 1, except they completely messed this up in every possible way. Zane's dialogue is just as robotic and bland as ever, with some all-timer terrible lines from him thrown into the mix, the worst of which being when he calls himself weird for dancing with birds back in Season 1, which completely misunderstands his early character. The Great Zane robbery ending with yet another melodramatic Zane fake-out death feels like such a punch to the face when Doc has outwardly acknowledged the problems with Zane's character, and it feels like they've just learned nothing from the mistakes they had made with his character previously. I understand that his tweet about this wouldn't have been made when they were writing Season 3, but when these complaints have been around for years, it just feels like it added insult to injury with Zane's character. Zane's entire early character being so badly misunderstood feels like the final nail in the coffin for him, and it's very unfortunate to say that Zane is just completely unsalvageable now, despite the amazing track record this show had of giving its Part 1 focus characters really compelling storylines. P.I.X.A.L also made her not so grand return this season, and she's just as bland as ever, and her relationship with Zane continues to be one of the worst ships this show has to offer. Zane and P.I.X.A.L have always had a really weird and overly codependent dynamic with one another, where they need each other to be able to function as people, so without each other they just completely break down. It's been an issue with them for years, but I really don't like how this season reaffirms this idea through more clunky Zane dialogue, and P.I.X.A.L's presence just feels very shoehorned in, and they clearly didn't have a place for her in this season whatsoever. I'm glad they were booted out for the second half, and their intro reasoning makes sense, but they absolutely did it because they didn't want to address how the spectral stuff would work with them, and since the temple's security bots aren't effective and have more personality than Zane or P.I.X.A.L combined, I really don't think they would have been hollowed out. I'm glad they got these guys off of my screen, but like, with the part being all about people's souls being stolen, it feels like they were boosted out so the show didn't have to address whether they have souls to be stolen, which feels a bit cheap, and I don't love that they seemingly took the easy way out on giving us an answer about what would happen to them in this situation. Zane and P.I.X.A.L are definitely my second biggest issues with this season. With how much emphasis was placed on them with the marketing, I expected a bit more from them, and unfortunately they just didn't meet my expectations, which were pretty low all things considered. In the case of Zane specifically, I think this is his worst outing of the entire franchise, because even though he was bad before, this season dials up every complaint I've had with his character for the past few years up to 10, and in my eyes he's just a completely unsalvageable character now, which really hurts to say because he used to be one of my favourite ninja. As I said though, Zane is only my second biggest disappointment with this season, so let's move on to what I think is the absolute worst part of Dragons Rising Season 3, that being the Forbidden 5 and Thunderfang, because, oh man, where do I even start with these guys? I've avoided talking about Forbidden 5 on here for the longest time since the initial Season 3 release. I was super disappointed with them in the first half of the season, and at least somewhat pleasantly surprised when they came back in Part 2, and I was really hoping that this was also a really masterful gambit on the part of Rox and Noct, leading them to get the power they wanted from Thunderfang, so that they could finally get the spotlight in Season 4, and well, that didn't end up happening. With this being all I'm assuming of what we get of a Forbidden 5, it's time to get into the dumpster fire that is this team. I really liked Noct during the tournament. I thought he was a really fun character with enough personality and intrigue for me to get behind the 5 as villains, and what we saw of Rox was really cool too, and she was seemingly built up to be the scariest of the lot. But come Season 3 they just completely shift their goal from conquering and destroying the world to freeing Thunderfang. It's such a colossal U-turn for their characters because there was absolutely no hint towards Thunderfang even being a thing in Season 2, and it would have been so easy to implement considering how dead set Blecht is on honouring the Source Dragons, or hell, the fact that Noct is literally at the site where Thunderfang was defeated. Along with the 5 now being dead set on freeing their master who came out of nowhere, they're going on a fetch quest to find some blades to free him. Having blades to free Thunderfang makes sense in theory. He was a war general in the fight against Vioni, and if they returned, it would make sense for them to want one of their strongest warriors to be on the field with them, but the big problem with this Blades fetch quest is that it splits up for Forbidden 5 and it means we don't get any interesting dynamics between them. The closest we get to any form of tension or conflict within the team is when Zarkt fails to get the blade, but even this ends up falling short. It's not surprising that Rox is going to threaten and punish someone who is effectively her underling, and it would have been far more interesting if someone like Noct had failed to get it, because we would have been able to see how far gone they are. I would have really liked to have seen something like this explored, but the show just doesn't seem interested in doing anything with them character-wise. Splitting them up instead of exploring their dynamics feels like such a wasted opportunity, and it leaves them feeling very bare bones. Until recently, I was under the impression that Thunderfang was a LEGO mandate of sorts, and had overwritten the story they had planned for the Forbidden 5. But from what I can understand, that doesn't seem to be the case. Duckbricks has shared that the 5 were always intended to be minions and Thunderfang's underlings, which I really don't know how to feel about, but I think that almost makes the Forbidden 5 worse. This having always been the plan makes the sudden switch from the 5's goals even more confusing, since there was absolutely no build up to this. And if this was always intended to be the plan, it makes the 5 being bland, nothing burger villains who don't have any interesting dynamics and very small pieces of characterization even more confusing to me. Because if this was their end goal, why would they set them up as the most dangerous beings who have ever lived, placing so much emphasis on them in Season 2? Their Part 2 integration is even worse in my eyes, because while I do really like the idea of Ghost Forbidden 5, harkening back to the idea that not even the Departed Realm can hold these guys, it doesn't feel earned since Forbidden 5 are not all that power-wise, and them being these walking husks that don't speak and have no character feels like the most outward confession that the show just does not care about these guys in the slightest, which again begs the question of why they would even do such extensive build-up for these guys. Thunderfang being planned is extremely confusing too when he himself doesn't do anything. He has all the basic building blocks to be a great villain with a killer design, awesome soundtrack, and some really solid motivations that make a lot of sense, but he just doesn't do anything. He sits around waiting to be freed in Part 1, promptly gets killed by Arin, and then spends Part 2 standing around only to be killed by Arin once again. Almost everything we know about him comes from the opening scene of the season, with the rest of what we get from him being him waffling on about how the Source Dragons will one day rue the day they rejected him, blah blah blah. The only slightly interesting thing we get from him is the fact that he thinks the Source Dragons are scared of him and clearly has this inflated sense of ego, but that's more relevant to the Source Dragons being apathetic and neglectful towards the mortals, and not something they use to make Thunderfang a compelling villain in any way. It's such a shame because I was really excited to see Thunderfang be our seasonal antagonist, but he just gets nothing at all. The villains this season puts in the spotlight are such a disappointment, man, and it really sucks that we traded Ras in for these chumps. It's especially disappointing that we spend so much time on them for Thunderfang to not get onto the council and for the Forbidden Five to be atomized. I get the irony they were going for by having the world be plunged into chaos despite Thunderfang being defeated, but if this was always the plan, why not just have him succeed with getting onto the council and becoming a Source Dragon? The show itself establishes that the Source Dragons need to vote for them to be able to do anything significant, so you could have him succeed and then realize that he's just signed himself up for a life of bureaucracy with the inability to do anything significant damage to the world, or get his revenge against the Source Dragons for that matter. If we're completely disregarding the 5 as characters for Thunderfang, it would at least be nice if they kept him around for future DR seasons, but no, he's just evaporated and double dead now with no hope of ever returning or being mentioned, which sucks so much. The villains we got for this season are absolutely the biggest letdown, and it's so unfortunate because Dragons Rising was on an absolutely generational run with its antagonists in Season 2. I want to take this opportunity to shine some light on projects that I think handle the Forbidden Five way better than the show, because these guys suck so bad that there are multiple fan projects that tell alternative stories about them, so I want to promote some that I think are really good. Some of you guys will have surely heard me bring up Brutality on this channel before, and it was written by my very good friend Gino. It's still ongoing with 18 chapters and nearly 400 pages, and it's all about the Forbidden Five and the Ras-Arin dynamic after the tournament. It's probably the most tightly written fan project I've ever seen spawn from Ninjago as a franchise, so please go check it out if you get the chance. It's absolutely fantastic and it's definitely worth a read, and it improves drastically on every issue I have for this season. Another fan project that I want to shine some light on is Bedrock Breaker's Reign of the Forbidden Five. It's a stop-motion series that takes place after Season 2 Part 1's Blood Moon, and it creates a world where the Forbidden Five really are the most dangerous warriors to ever live. And like Brutality, it establishes some really interesting dynamics within the team, and does a much better job than the show does at paying off Forbidden Five as conquerors and a group that have known each other for centuries. Links to both Brutality and the first chapter of Reign of the Forbidden Five are in the description of this video, so please go give them both a look. Gino and Bedrock have done an absolutely fantastic job with both of their projects and put a huge amount of effort into each of them, and I cannot give them enough praise for what they've accomplished. Now that I've shone some light on those, I'm going to take a break from talking about character stuff to discuss some of the world building this season does, and it's a very mixed bag on the whole, but there is some stuff that I really like. So to start off with some positives, the two main things that I want to gush about are the Spectral Lands and the Realm of Lee. The Spectral Lands episode as a whole was probably my favourite of Part 1's lot, and I think the way it explains the Departed and Cursed realms is absolutely brilliant. Having both of these realms be a physical place in the merged lands did worry me a bit, but what we ended up getting finally gave Death and Ninjago an inconclusive answer, and that's a brilliant way to retcon Ninjago's busted afterlife system. The Underworld was also a really cool addition to this season, and it means that we now have an answer to the question of what happened to every afterlife realm after the merge. I do take slight issue with the way to get into the Underworld being essentially the same as before, with there being certain spots around the world to get in, but considering it's an Underworld realm, I can't be too mad since I myself can't think of the best way to do it. So overall, I am happy with how it was included, and it means we're free for free on Dragons Rising successfully tackling its afterlife realms. As mentioned before, we finally learnt about the elusive Realm of Lee this season, and when I tell you my jaw dropped to the floor when the bunker was revealed, I am not joking. Having a place in the merged lands takes some very heavy inspiration from the Truman Show is so sick, and it's one of the most creative usages we've gotten out of a merged concept in the entire show. The whole mystery element as to why Lee is doing all of this was a lot of fun too. I'll talk about Lee as a character in depth a bit later, but for now I really like how we don't get an explanation for what Lee actually is. He could just kind of clone himself, and I think it adds a lot to the liminal feeling the realm has. I will say though, this was a complaint I had with Monstrosity that can be brought over here, but like, could the Land of Lee not have also been a part of a Realm of Madness? I don't think it's as egregious as Land of Monsters and Land of Madness being separate, because Lee does do enough to make itself feel justified as an entire realm, but like, I really don't think it would have changed a lot had this been an isolated island off the shore of a Realm of Madness. Again, I don't think this is a huge deal, because I don't think it's as big of a waste of a realm slot on like a certain new 2025 realm, but when we have a limited amount of realms they can pull from, having an entire one be dedicated to just one island that we know of so far isn't the best move in my opinion. Before we move on from Lee, I just want to say that I really loved the musical number. It was a lot of fun and it's a highlight of the season for me. Moving on from new realms and lands, let's talk about some old ones, because the first half of this season was the grand return of the first realm, and introduced a new tribe of people called the Dragonians. Going into this season, I was really excited to see how they were going to tie what we saw of the first realm in season 9 to Thunderfang and the Dragonians, And in the case of Thunderfang, they somewhat succeeded by having his backstory intertwined with the Oni and Dragon War, but other than that, they don't do anything to tie the Dragonians, Dragon Spitjutsu, and the Prismatic Blades into what we already knew about this realm, which unfortunately means that the first lands this season kind of suck. We don't learn anything about the relationship between the Dragonians and the Dragon Hunters, or where they were during the events of Season 9, when we really should have learnt about this in the time we spent here this season. Dragon Spitjutsu in particular is a real sore spot for me, because they just call it a First Lands thing, which wasn't established in Season 9 at all, and wasn't explained in this season here beyond one line from Lloyd. It would have been really easy to tie Dragon Spinjitzu back to Soul Energy and the Prismatic Blades, and since the ninja only really do it when there's Prismatic Steel nearby, it wouldn't have changed anything about the way it's used. I won't spend too long on the blades themselves since they've been talked about a lot by other people, but yeah, they're not much better. They just appear in random places of emerged lands for weak payoff to mysteries, and that's about it unfortunately. I really don't have much to say on them. Coming back to the Dragonians though, what the hell was possessing them in part 1, and what are the spectral Dragonians? Thunderfang just happens to have this ring that can corrupt the Dragonians with the souls of the damned, and then he just has more evil ones in part 2 for some reason? They don't explain either of these, leaving both parts having random and unexplained villain factions that feel like complete asspulls. It's such a shame because the same thing happened last year with the Wolf Mask Warriors, and I cannot imagine it would have been hard to put in a couple of lines in either season explaining how our villains get their armies, but there's just nothing. To close off on my rant about the Dragonians, I want to quickly talk about Tyr specifically. I admittedly wouldn't be talking about this guy if brutality didn't exist, but what's the deal with him? The name Tyr has mythological origins and he's the Norse god of war, so having absolutely no reference to this in the show is really weird, and having it would have added a lot of substance to Dragonians, which I feel like they really need. If you have a bit of time, I would advise reading up on Tyr's mythological roots, because it's some really interesting stuff and the show would have really benefited from taking some inspiration from it. Another old realm we revisit in part 1 is Ninjago, and seeing the payoff to their setup in season 1 was another thing I was really excited to see, but unfortunately it's another case of this season completely messing up an old location. I'm pretty sure they break every single piece of pre-established lore we had about Ninjago. The rules about not wishing for harm are broken multiple times, Aracor can seemingly deny wishes when the latter half of season 6 is all about the ninja using this trick to defeat Nalakan. And while I could be wrong about this, I am 90% sure that they break the 3 wishes rule with at least one of the characters here. They don't even keep their new lore consistent either, because Aracor not being able to send Dareth home but being able to bring the ninja to and from Ninjago makes absolutely no sense. The Cave of Tone stuff here also kind of sucks if I'm being honest. I really thought they were setting up Xanth to become the purple half of the Archdragon of Focus, because they were setting up the Cave of the Dragon maybe not even being there in the first place. Xanth also just so happens to get her big power up moment shortly after Thor and Thrak finish yodeling the spell song. It's not a major thing, but it really annoys me to no end, because now they've canonized that Aracor can just seemingly create life if someone wishes for it, which I'm really not a huge fan of. The final lore / world building thing that I really want to touch on is the focus versus chaos dichotomy this season gives us. Dragons Rising Season 2 focuses a lot on the idea of motion versus strength in part 1 and 2 respectively, and we really get to see how these different ideologies and worldviews bounced off of one another, which massively contributed to the season being as engaging as it is. In this season, however, focus and chaos don't get nearly as much, and each one feels really unclear if you're just watching the season or not checking Blue Sky posts for answers. We just don't get a clear sense of what each one entails, with neither focus or chaos getting a clear definition of what they actually are in the season. It's a real shame that these two ideologies aren't elaborated on at all, and if I'm being honest, I also just don't think they chose a particularly good source to oppose chaos. Focus versus chaos works on a very surface level in my opinion. I think flow would have been a far better pick, since to me it evokes a constant state of change that shapes the world around it without taking, serving as a middle ground to motion and strength. That sounds like a good way to counteract an ever-changing world of chaos while nuancing what the show has already given us, instead of a colossal U-turn that is focus versus chaos. Overall, focus versus chaos just feels very unclear, one-note and surface level compared to strength versus motion, and I really wish we got more of a nuancing and focus on strength versus motion because those are far more interesting than the dichotomy we got this season. To not so subtly transition into the next topic, I want to talk about how the season is structured because it's really weird in my opinion. The whole part 1 and 2 structure has and probably always will be how DR is packaged and released, and I remember a big talking point with season 2 is how connected and disconnected that season feels at the same time. and I kind of feel that way about this season if I'm being entirely honest. It's the first time where I feel like the two parts really rely on each other to deliver its overall story, because while Season 2's parts definitely do rely and bounce off of one another, a lot of this season's first half only really started to click with me when I saw where the second half was taking these characters, and I think the parts this season don't stand alone as much as previous ones have. Despite this fact, the season is very, very messy, and I think it's because they had far too many subplots going on at the same time. In just part 1 alone, we have the main plot with the fetch quest, which we jump around a lot on anyway since there are 5 blades to be found, the Ras and Arin subplot, the Finding J plot which then becomes a Roby subplot, and then we're also cutting to Thunderfang in the cave, and it's clearly just way too much for the show to handle. At any given point, part 1 has about 4 different plots it could cut to in one episode, and it can really disrupt the flow of the story at times. Part 2 is definitely a lot better with how it handles its plot distribution. We have a main Land of Lee plot with a ninja trying to find Arin's parents, with a Ras, Arin and Sora subplot going on in the background, and when that reaches its conclusion we switch to the Kai, Cole and Frack subplot. I definitely like this structure a lot better, and it makes part 2 feel a lot more focused and tidy than part 1 does. I think part 2's plot is just generally more interesting too. Part 1 has the ninja trying to find Arin and running into the Forbidden Five along the way, eventually completely shifting gears to the ninja focusing on defeating the Forbidden Five and somehow running into Ras and Arin, whereas part 2 has the ninja trying to find Arin's parents after Eagle's death, with them completing their mission and then focusing on taking down Thunderfang once and for all. Something I really appreciate about part 2 is the fact that the ninja don't get their quest through some lore-heavy ramble about the journey they're about to go on from a cosmically powered being. It's an issue that both the previous seasons have, and I'm glad Eagle's death allowed the ninja to come to their own conclusions about what they needed to do. It adds a lot of impact since the part revolves around trying to fulfill Eagle's dying wish, which is really neat in my opinion and a good change of pace, and I hope they continue to structure their part 2s like this. While on the topic of it, Eagle's death is something that really got me, and it's definitely an all-timer Ninjago scene in my eyes, and it feels like a really lovely send-off to one of Dragons Rising's best characters. I definitely think this scene could have been enhanced had we seen Eagle looking noticeably worse in the first half of the season, because it is a bit out of nowhere and it would have been nice to see a bit more of him before he died, but that doesn't make what we got any less fantastic. Eagle never really got the chance to apologise for how he treated Arin before his passing, and the insinuation that he wants to apologise to him before going really does a lot to reaffirm that Eagle didn't carry hate in his heart towards the ninja, with his anger being driven by a lack of hope and only seeing the worst in the world. His death is unfortunate, but it was a really brilliant way to drive the story forward, and I'm glad his death was handled so well within the story itself. Another wonderfully handled Andrew Francis character this season was Cole. While it's a bit unfortunate that he wasn't very present for the first half of the season, every time he was there he was an absolute joy to watch, with his conversation with Lloyd already being one of my favourite scenes from this season. Part 2 was great for Cole as well. While he does get put on the subplot again, his dynamic with Kai and Frack is always a lot of fun, and we finally got an answer to the Screaming Earth mystery from season 1, which is awesome. I do think this plot is paced a little weirdly, and they probably could have had Cole and Frack do this in part 1 since neither of them really have a lot to do there, and it would have really helped with the pacing of it on the whole, but I think the payoff is some really good stuff nonetheless. Learning that the dead Source Dragon of Balance's body was even in the mortal world to begin with is an insane discovery, and it sets up some really interesting stuff about finding balance amid the chaos of emerged lands. After this, we get what I think is the highlight of Cole's Dragons Rising characterization. Cole isn't a character who really gets angry or overly aggressive, but after seeing his family get squad wiped by Nox, he just starts completely crashing out, and it's brilliant. I've seen some people say that Cole should have been smarter than to try and take Nox head on, but I think it really works for Cole's character here. It makes a lot of sense that he would act irrationally and out of anger when Cole is, at his core, a family man, and he just saw most of his family die without being able to do anything about it. While it was an undeniably bad idea to try and attack Nox head on without an upgraded blade, I can't really blame Cole for thinking it was a good idea when he had just seen the people he's closest to die. I'm glad we got to see a new side of Cole too, because Dragons Rising as a whole hasn't really explored the more irrational thoughts that come with having a family for Cole, and it's good that we're finally exploring this reaction about this sort of thing for Cole when the Tournament of Sources didn't really do any of that when Bonzo was trapped in the nether space. It was really sick seeing a new side to Cole this season, and I think it's probably the best he's been written in any Dragons Rising season to date. He continues to be one of my favourite members of the Ninja team, and I am really looking forward to seeing where the future takes him. A character who I am a bit mixed on is Kai, because he kinda sucks in the first half if I'm being honest. His dynamic with Wildfire is still pretty fun, but that's kind of a given with Dragons Rising seasons, and beyond that he's just a really nothing character, which really hurts to say with how much I loved him in season 2. He just kind of went back to being the 11-minute era Kai for no reason at all, and when part 2 rolled around, he was just really good again for no reason whatsoever. I'm not complaining since I'm glad Kai hasn't gone back to being a washed character, but it's so funny to me that he just randomly go back to sucking for 10 episodes before being great again. The stuff Kai does get in the second half is solid though. It's a lot like Dragons Rising Season 2 where they really highlight how far he's come as a character, and it's always lovely to see his development be relevant to the character arcs and used in interesting ways. Kai was definitely very 50-50 this season, but I do still really like him despite my issues with how he's written in the first half, and Dragons Rising continues to do him a lot of justice even when he's taking a backseat. Another character who I think was fumbled in part 1 is Wildfire, but unlike Kai, she doesn't really get any better in part 2. While I don't agree with the take that her character was hijacked by Roby in the Tournament of Sorcerers, it absolutely was in the first half of this season. It really sucks because Roby being decayed doesn't amount to anything for Wildfire character-wise, she just heals him with heat and that's about it. It's cool that they expanded on her powers a bit since apparently heat and decay do oppose each other in real life, but all of this is just for one small expansion of her powers, and it feels like such a colossal waste of screen time. When Roby also gets hollowed in part 2, it just feels like wholly pointless for him to have been decayed in part 1 in general. She's marginally better in part 2, but I still take issue with how she's handled. We do at the very least get to see her interact with more members of the team, and her dynamic with Jay is a lot of fun, and I think the Land of Lee is a really interesting set piece for Wildfire to be put into. It highlights her development nicely since she didn't blow their cover or destroy the town, which is something she absolutely would have done in season 1. But other than that, she's a pretty stagnant character this season, and her arc about adjusting to a new lifestyle isn't pushed forward in any interesting ways. It's especially baffling that she doesn't get anything substantial in part 2 relating to Eagle's death either. They were really close and I expected her to get some substantial stuff, but there's just not much there. The closest the show comes to relating the things she does to Eagle's passing words to her is her intuition being correct when it comes time to ring the bells, which is neat enough but it isn't really anything of substance. This season really does kill all of the momentum the show had going for her character, and just to be clear, I don't hate her this season or anything, she's still really fun but I wanted a lot more from her, and what we got really misses the mark and just makes her a very stagnant and bland character on the whole. Since I brought Roby up briefly, I want to touch on his character as well, because despite my issues with Wildfire's story in part 1 revolving around him and him kind of hijacking it, I actually think the stuff we get for his character is kind of awesome. Having Roby realize that it's important to remember history to preserve the good stuff in the present is some really great development after how he never comes to this realization in season 2, and it feels like a solid bookend to his character arc. Light was also in this season, and while he doesn't have anything too interesting, and pretty much just serves as a lore dump about the Archdragon and focus on Thunderfang, his inclusion was pretty neat nonetheless, and I like his small conflict about going against the Source Dragons to protect them and the world. Other than that, I don't really have anything else to say about these two. I'm glad they were here, and that's about it. I just hope Roby doesn't continue to sabotage Wildfire's stories in the future seasons. Back on topic though, Wildfire isn't the only ninja trainee who let me down this season, because Thrak also isn't very good, I fear. I really loved him in season 2, and the way he paralleled Arin was fantastic, and really helps build up Arin's self-doubt issues and plays a large part in him eventually joining Ras. But I feel like this season does a really weak job at following up on this story. They set up some interesting stuff with him in episode 1, like him having to unlearn some of what he already knows, but they don't ever really follow up on this. After this point, he doesn't have anything while unlearning strength and just immediately becomes Raz's biggest hater and acts like Arin's been mind controlled by him. It surely could not have been hard to tie his story in with Arin's, and it's a real shame that we don't see him empathize with Arin and have him understand why he would join someone like Ras, because while the show tells us that Thrak understands the downsides, he should also understand the upsides better than anyone and try and talk about it with Arin. Ras has definitely done a lot of bad stuff, but they put someone on the team who would understand why someone would join Ras and gets the benefits of it, and they just don't do anything with it. It would have been really interesting for them to lean into Thrak's journey being the opposite of Arin's, but they just don't do any of that, and instead opt for the focus of his character arc to be his crush on Sora. It's a pretty cute idea, but it's the only thing that comes close to being substantial for him this season, and even then it's still kind of a nothing burger. Thrak is unfortunately just a massive letdown, and I hope he has some good stuff in the future, but with how the Ras and Arin plotline ends up going, I don't think we'll get anything too substantial from his character from here on out. While I'm ranting about ninja trainees, I'm going to talk about Ryu. I mentioned this in my Tournament of Sorcerers review, but I am not the biggest Ryu fan. He doesn't do all too much, and I tend to forget about him when he isn't on screen, and that complaint is definitely at its worst this season. Ryu is still one of my least favourite characters on the ninja team, and if Zane and P.I.X.A.L didn't completely suck, he would definitely be at the bottom. I don't think he does anything of note for this entire season except for Spinjitzu in the finale, and I genuinely could not tell you what else he does this season. And bear in mind, I've seen both parts multiple times. In part 1, he's there to do the occasional bit of visual comedy, and in part 2, they just write him out completely to train with Ronto to justify him doing some ninjutsu in the finale. But even then, that doesn't feel particularly earned for him at this point. I'm sorry, but I just cannot bring myself to care about Ryu when he doesn't do anything interesting or relevant to the current story. And I feel like I'm just waiting for the inevitable reveal that he's a Source Dragon so that he can finally have something to do. Ronto also wasn't particularly good if I'm being honest. I thought she worked really well in Season 2 as a contrast to Eagle, and to be a bit more of a supportive master figure to the ninja, but with Eagle gone she just feels a bit bland, and I feel like she doesn't have too much of a character at the minute. I do hope she gets a bit more development this season, but even then, in the grand scheme of things, it isn't a big deal, but I still wish she had a bit more to her. I think there's definitely a blow issue with the Dragons Rising cast at the moment, because there are just way too many characters for the show to flesh them out properly. It was a shame that the old ninja weren't getting as much material in the earlier parts, but it made sense since, yeah, the show just doesn't focus on them as much anymore, which is completely fine, but now it seems like this issue is spreading to the newer team members as well. Frag, Wildfire, and Ryu are all getting neglected by the show at the minute, and it does beg the question of why they would add so many characters to the team if they clearly don't have the time to explore all of them in depth. I can understand not exploring the old ninjas much since this isn't their story, but Frank already getting shafted to the subplot in his first season on the team is rough. I have hope we'll see their stories play out in some interesting ways next season, because them being all split up across the merged lands will hopefully allow for dedicated episodes for each team plot, and I hope that some good character stuff comes from it now that each cast has the room to breathe. I really do hope the next season shifts their focus towards the newer characters and properly fleshes them out, because at the minute most of them are quite static and a bit boring if I'm being honest. Putting that aside, I'm going to move on to Jay and Nia. I'll start with Jay because, and bear with me through the Shameless Self promo, I already made a video on him a few weeks ago where I talk about him in depth and discuss why this season is the best he's been in years, so I'd recommend you give that a look because I'm not going to repeat everything I say there here. But in short, this season does a perfect job of addressing the flanderization Jay has suffered from in the past few years, giving us a fantastic arc about him wanting to overcome his selfishness and greed to be a better person to those around him. I have absolutely no issue with how Jay was handled in either of these parts, and I am so glad that this season did him justice. I really hope season 4 can keep the momentum they have with his character going, and that they stick the landing with it, because Jay was brilliant here. Nia was also really well handled this season in my opinion. While I do think she doesn't have anything too interesting in part 1, and some parts of her search for Jay are active time wasters, she gets a lot of interesting stuff in part 2 now that she's actually found Jay, and she gets a really interesting story about learning to accept change. Throughout this part, we see Nia have to accept that Jay just isn't the person he used to be, while also trying to get him to be a better person. We really get a feel for how hard it is for her to see Jay transformed into a completely different person, and with the Powlers and Gandalaria stuff being about how important communication is, I think it'll be really interesting to see Nia apply this to her relationship with Jay next season. I do hope they start to do some other stuff with Nia beyond her story with Jay now though, because I don't want all of her presence in DR to be tied to him, but what we did get of her was some pretty substantial stuff, so I can forgive her not having all too much outside of it. Both Jay and Nia were really good this season, and they continue to be really well written and handled in Dragons Rising, with this being a high point of Jay's character. I am a big fan of the dynamic these two had this season, and I am really looking forward to seeing where it goes. The last of the old ninja is Lloyd. He was the highlight of season 2 for me, and both his master and anxiety stories really resonated with me, and going in, he was one of the characters I was looking forward to the most, since he's lost one of his students and has to deal with the fact that Wu caused the merge. His arc this season was shaping up to be all about Lloyd being disillusioned with Wu, trying to separate himself from his teachings, carve his own path as a master, and overcome his flaws as a mentor to Arin. Now that we have a continuation to the story though, I have some mixed feelings on it. It's very weird because I've never gotten the sense that they messed up and stuck the landing with a character's story this much before. His arc this season is in this very weird stage where they seem to be setting up his disillusionment with Wu even more, despite him having more than enough reason to be already, but I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, but it only works if they follow through with it in season 4. Putting this aside for a minute though, let's take a look at what's actually here. Part 1 is very weird for Lloyd, because despite seeing their chaos and destruction brought across the merged lands, he defends Wu's actions with a retort that he probably had a good reason, which granted is most likely true, but him saying this as a response to Arin grieving his thought to be dead parents feels very tone deaf, and comes across as a blind defense of Wu's actions, which isn't helped by the fact that he treats Arin like a brainwashed prisoner of war right before this. He just comes across as a bit uncaring, which isn't helped by the fact that as soon as he knows what the deal with the prismatic blaze is, he immediately ditches the search for Arin to go and fight the Five. Saving the world and stopping the Forbidden Five is obviously important, but I really wish we got to see him consider postponing the search for Arin to stop the Five, because it would have done a lot to justify his sudden change in motivations. At the end of part 1, he does accept that Arin and Sora are free to make their own choices, but there isn't really anything that makes him come to this realization that he needs to let go. Luckily, the second half does expand upon this, with Lloyd having to realize that he needs to let go of members of the team sometimes, like Zane and P.I.X.A.L for example, who want some time to themselves, and he starts to accept the fact that Arin doesn't have to become the best ninja that ever lived in the finale. I'm really hoping that this leads to a story in season 4 about him letting go of Wu's clearly outdated ways, where he stops denying that his uncle has plunged the world into chaos despite any good intentions and Arin's parents being alive. They did kind of drop the concept of light in the dark and darkness in the light that they had going last season, but I think they can definitely pick up on it again next season, and I really hope that Arin and Lloyd being stranded in what I assume is the wilderness leads to some interesting stuff for both of them, especially with how much Arin improved under Ras. My thoughts on all of this are all obviously very dependent on where they go with it in season 4, because if they never address the consequences of Wu's actions among the team members, it would be a massive blunder on the part of the writers. Unfortunately though, the other half of Lloyd's arc was just completely dropped this season, because we get basically nothing about the visions and Lloyd's dealing with the stress that comes with them. We do get that one vision in part 2 where he sees the Source Dragons, but it wasn't used to further his anxiety storyline in any way, and its only real purpose is to forward the overall plot of awakening the Archdragon of Focus and stopping Thunderfang. It's such a massive shame that they didn't do anything with it this season, because it's definitely the part of this season 2 story that resonated with me the most, so seeing it no longer be relevant really sucks in my opinion. Lloyd does have a lot of messy writing this season, but I don't particularly think it's bad. They seem to be pushing him in a direction that has him be disillusioned with Wu, making him a better teacher to Arin, so my thoughts on Lloyd are very reliant on what they do with him next season, but for the meantime, I think it was some pretty solid stuff, and I am looking forward to seeing where they go with it in the future. Moving on to Sora, I think the continuation of her arc was some really solid stuff overall. Her season 2 story was all about her wanting to be a better friend to those around her after seeing the effects of how she had treated people like Arin and Jordana. Both of them ended up following Ras because of their experiences with Sora, and I want to clarify, she isn't a bad person because of this. She lied to Arin because she thought it was the right thing to do, and when she was in Imperium, she was a literal kid, so I don't think it's all too fair to put the blame on her for not noticing Jordana while at school. Nonetheless, her current story arc is all about her wanting to be better to those around her, which is handled well overall, but to some very mixed results in some places. My main issues with it are her dynamic with Thrak and her motivation for joining Arin and Ras. Again, Thrak having a crush on Sora is a really cute idea and I'm not against it, but what we got was Thrak being a weirdo to Sora and Sora just being extremely mean to him. I get that the whole point is that she was lashing out since Thrak was overstepping quite a lot, but when the whole point of our arc is being more communicative, it would have been nice to see her make progressive and active strides in doing so with Thrak. As mentioned briefly before, I also think her motivation for joining Arin and Ras was a bit weak. They clearly wanted to do an it's us versus the world story with them, but I feel like this wasn't as fleshed out as it could have been, and they could have had her become more disillusioned with the ninja after Lloyd tried to justify the death of Arin's parents as a means to an end, which would have done a lot to add to her wanting to be there for a friend and really hammer home the idea that it's them against the world. Also, just another quick thing, when she joins Arin and Ras, she's seemingly fine with reversing the merge for whatever reason. I assume the idea was that she wants to help Arin and knew she wouldn't lose all too much from the merge being reversed, but she has absolutely no thoughts about it and just kind of accepts it. Since they have Arin and Ras split up anyways, they could have easily had her discover what they were up to, with her shock and disappointment serving as a wake up for Arin as he realizes what he's about to do just for his parents. Problems aside though, I think her story was really strong this season. While I'm not the biggest fan of the flashbacks and crashing together, since I don't think they add too much to the overall story, I like that they have Sora and Arin parallel each other by having both of them run away from each other after a small miscommunication that makes the other feel worthless. The ending scene with the grapple gun is an all-time Ninjago scene as well. It's fantastically directed and was clearly made with a lot of love. The way she and Arin make up was really well done too, and while it would have been nice for Sora to get the chance to apologize, you can clearly see that she recognizes her fault in this situation even if it wasn't explicitly stated immediately. Her arc ending with her meetup with Lee was also a really smart move in my opinion. Both Sora and Lee have tried to maintain friendships through lies, and I think Sora being faced with how quickly something like a lie can get out of hand is a really sound conclusion to her arc. And her talk with Lee means we get her outwardly acknowledging her own faults, which was a really lovely conclusion to our arc about being a better friend and treating the people around her a bit better. Just to quickly touch on Lee as a character, since I said I would earlier in the video, he is a fantastic character and I absolutely adore him. He's a lot of fun in the Land of Lee plot, and his whole vibe of being a cheery neighbor who has the power to multiply and make people disappear adds a lot to the liminal and eerie feeling the Land of Lee has. His whole character ties into the themes of unity this season has going for it wonderfully, and he's a brilliant antagonist for Sora to have an albeit brief interaction with, and the way they finish each other's arcs is really well done in my opinion. To finish up with Sora, her story this season was really strong of a whole, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where it goes since she's now at the Shadow Dojo it seems, and I'm really hoping that Jordana will be there next season so that they can finally mend their relationship and finally pick up on where season 2 left it. The last thing I want to talk about is the Arin and Ras dynamic. Their dynamic was the highlight of Dragons Rising Season 2 for me, so seeing how it would play out and evolve this season was without a doubt the thing I was the most excited to see, and while I've seen a lot of mixed thoughts about how it played out this season, I personally think that for the most part, they absolutely stuck the landing with it. When part 1 dropped, I remember it being basically the only thing I liked about the season, and while I definitely liked part 1 as a whole a lot more with the context of the second half, Ras and Arin were absolutely the best parts of it, and this season continues the brilliant dynamic they had in season 2 in some really interesting ways. Arin's whole story this season is trying to get to grips with Ras's ideology of strength, with the looming question of whether he has the strength necessary to do the things that need to be done to bring his parents back to life, and this season does a fantastic job at developing this idea. Arin's slow realization that his anger and hate aren't the source of his strength, but rather his hope and kindness, is a brilliant continuation to his season 2 story. Another part of this story that I really loved was Arin trying to figure out what it means to be a hero, and to reach his conclusion, Dragons Rising takes a huge risk by having him interact with Morrow, bringing him back after 10 whole years. As mentioned at the very start of this video, Morrow's return was the thing I was the most worried about going into this season, because his story loosely mirrors Arin's in some areas, and I was extremely worried that they would lead into these parallels to get Arin back on the ninja's side. Thankfully they didn't end up going down this route, which means that Morrow's inclusion in this season was perfectly handled in my opinion. What he does contribute to Arin's story is really damn good, and serves as a perfect bookend to his story. Morrow is the person that makes Arin realize that heroes do in fact exist and brings meaning to the word, and brings Arin closer to Ras by saying that Ras is obviously important to him, which I think is some sound usage of him and fits into the themes of the story nicely. I'm so glad that my fears didn't end up coming to pass with Morrow, and he was definitely a highlight of this season for me. The writers clearly understand how to bring back legacy characters, and if they do bring back any more in the future, I'm really excited to see what they do with them. Moving back over to Arin, as I said earlier, a big part of his arc this season is having him do the hard thing to complete the mission at hand. The only notable instances of it in part 1 are when he needs to choose between saving the villagers and finding his parents, and then betraying the mountain dragons to save Ras, but part 2's main Ras and Arin plot point is the Casket of Bones. From what I've seen, this is definitely one of the most divisive parts of this season, but I think it really works for both Ras and Arin as characters, and it feels in line with what both of their characters are meant to be and to represent. I was definitely against the idea of them splitting up in season 3, but I think it works really well with what part 1 sets up, since Arin now knows that his strength comes from hope and his kindness, so his relationship with Ras was bound to fail. One thing in particular that I really appreciate is Arin finally realizing that what he wants to force out of life is actively harmful to a lot of other people, and the possibility of losing Sora to bring his parents back is such a brilliant way to address this obsession he has. Arin learning that change is necessary and important, tying back to the idea in season 1 that change is a good thing, is a really impactful way to end his arc when he thinks his parents are dead. I definitely think they could have accomplished all of this without his parents being alive in the story though. I'm fine with them being there, but it would have been far more compelling if he did this and we didn't know they were alive, but nonetheless it's some really good stuff for him, and the reunion he has with his parents after all he's been through feels very earned and it's very sweet. I definitely think that what we get afterwards isn't as good as the stuff he was getting when he was with Ras, because of a lot of time he's just kind of there in the background, and while I like the idea of him wanting to leave the team after reuniting everyone from Lee with their loved ones, it's a shame he doesn't follow through with it in the end. I get what they were going for with the realization that he isn't a screw up and that he is capable of being a ninja, but I think this plot point could have done with a bit more time to breathe and to be a bit more developed. Despite some issues with his story towards the end though, I am really happy with how his story ended up going this season, and I'm really curious to see how they'll follow through with it next season. I particularly hope his dynamic with Lloyd builds off of some of the tension they had this season, because I'd really like to see if that be expanded upon. The final character to talk about is Ras, and he is still the absolute GOAT of this show, and was absolutely carrying with how much the other villains suck. I don't think I have as much to say about him as I do Arin without going too in depth, but this season continues to cement that Ras is this franchise's best villain. We learned some really good stuff about him this season, finally getting his motivation behind wanting to reverse a merge, and learning that his master can't be the source dragon of strength. Ras doing all of this to bring his people back is a brilliant goal for him to have, especially when he's someone who, at his very core, seeks to break up the unity of the world, so having his end goal be the desire to bring his people back again is a great way to bring even more nuance to his character. We get a lot of great insights into his beliefs too, like learning about his views on emotional attachment, and we get to see how the means to an end mentality he has shapes the way he goes about life. Casket of Bones is a really interesting point for him as a villain too. Ras spends all of part 1 injured, constantly being humiliated by the Forbidden Five and Rogue. Ras being off his game this much leads to his dynamic with Arin being really interesting, since they're completely dependent on each other for different reasons, but come part 2 he's fully healed and is once again an absolute beast in battle. And his sudden turn on Sora feels like his grand return moment after a whole season of him trying to come across as a sympathetic man to those around him. They do a brilliant job of balancing the idea that he does genuinely want to help Arin with the fact that he is bad to the bone, and this really sudden reminder is a really important part of his dynamic with Arin, because it's the thing that makes him realise they're not one and the same. Pretty much everything that made him good in season 2 persists into this season, and I've been loving what they've been doing with him. Every single time he's on screen, I am on the edge of my seat, and I cannot wait to see how his plan unfolds next season. Unfortunately, I can't go into too much detail on either Ras or Arin, because I do have plans for a future video about their dynamic this season, but do know that I really liked most of what they did this season, and I look forward to seeing how their journey progresses even though they're no longer together. After a lot of talking, that finally sums up all of my thoughts on the individual aspects of this season. And I'm sure anyone who's made it this far will have noticed that I have a lot of conflicting thoughts on this season. Some of it, like the Jade, Arin and Ras stories, are really, really good, and a lot of other stuff like Zane, the Forbidden Five and Thunderfang are really, really, really bad. I've tried to give my thoughts as in-depth as I can for a season review, because I do want to make more in-depth analyses later on different parts of this season while giving my thoughts in a way that feels complete here. But on the whole, I do think that this season was a very big mess. It has a lot of issues, and straight up, it isn't what I wanted from a follow-up to Dragons Rising Season 2. This season messes up a lot of stuff from that season, and in a lot of ways, it is a letdown, but I think in other ways, it's a really solid Ninjago story. This season was clearly made with a lot of love, care, and passion put into it, even if some parts of it are just downright terrible. Despite a lot of issues, I think this season does do a really good job at continuing the themes of change and unity that the first season's built up, and I think that on the whole, it is a decent follow-up to Dragons Rising's story. My thoughts on this season are very dependent on where the future of Dragons Rising takes us, because with this only being the second act of Dragons Rising's overarching story, a lot of its messiness can be attributed between it trying to bridge the gap between the setup of the first 2 seasons with the payoff of future seasons, and while I don't think this season does a perfect job of doing that, it hasn't really shaken the faith I have in Dragons Rising's overarching narrative, and I do like this season quite a lot despite my myriad of issues with it. I am very excited to see where the future of Dragons Rising takes us, and I hope that Season 4 continues to push forward in new and exciting ways. Thank you so much to everyone who's watched this video up until this point. The support you've all given me recently has been absolutely amazing, and I cannot thank you guys enough. I do want to make a quick point to say that it is completely okay for people to dislike this season. Opinions are inevitably going to differ, and not everyone is going to agree with you on a given topic, which is completely fine. I've seen a lot of divisiveness surrounding this season so far, and all I ask is that people be respectful about the different takes that are inevitably going to spawn from such a messy season. If you do want to discuss Ninjago in a civil manner with other fans, there should be a link to my Discord server on screen now and in the description of this video. Alongside that, there are also links to the first chapter of Reign of the Forbidden Five, along with the entirety of Gina's brutality. Thank you all again so much for watching, and I will see you all soon. Goodbye for now. I actually can't believe they messed the Forbidden Five up that badly though. Like, how are they this fraudulent? actual useless barrels of monkey spunk.
When you feel tight, look at yourself. Inside your heart, you will find a special place to align. When you feel right, look at yourself. Inside your mind, you see, come make it true.